Let's be honest about what's happening in South Sudan right now. This isn't just political instability. This isn't just growing pains of a young nation. What we are witnessing is a government that has completely abandoned any pretense of democratic governance, and it's actively dismantling the very institution that could hold it accountable. And frankly, it's time we call it what it is, a slide into outright dictatorship. This week alone, we've seen 3 developments that should alarm anyone who cares about justice, human rights, or basic governance. And when you connect the dots, the picture that emerges is deeply disturbing. So let's talk about it, because the silent and South Sudan's authoritarian turn has gone on long enough. First, let's talk about Justice Minister Joseph Genga-Kech. This man, whose job is literally to uphold the rule of law, has warned the public and the international community not to comment on Riek MACHAR'S trial. His reasoning, it could be contempt of court.
Is to pass a word of caution that I have listened to comments on the ongoing judicial process. The court has announced, and we have made it clear many times, that matters in court are not discussed outside, that judicial processes are not subject for debate. And in fact, the court called this contempt if you go against it. So I urge that if you are going to comment, for example, on the implementation of the peace process, that this particular judicial proceedings is not up for discussion because the matter is in court. I think this is important for everybody to underscore.
Now, I want you to think about this for a second. The Justice Minister is telling you that discussing whether a trial is fair could be a crime, not interfering with witnesses, not threatening judges, simply talking about it. Does that sound like justice to you? Or does that sound like a government terrified of scrutiny? Here's the thing. Contempt of court exists in democracies to protect jury trial from prejudicial publicity. South Sudan doesn't have jury trials, so what exactly is being protected here? The answer is obvious. They are protecting themselves from criticism. They are trying to criminalize public discourse because they know that if people actually examine what's happening in the courtroom, the whole charade falls apart. This is dictatorship 101. When you can't defend your actions, you silence the questions. And that's exactly what Kech is trying to do. And speaking of silencing questions, let's talk about what happened to independent media of this trial. The court initially promised transparency. They said it would be open to the public. That lasted exactly 3 hearings. Starting from the 4th session, security forces have physically barred independent journalists from entering Freedom Hall. The Freedom Hall, yeah. Think about it. Think about the audacity of that. They made a promise of transparency, got the initial positive coverage, and then immediately broke that promise the moment people stopped paying attention. The only media outlets allowed inside now? The state-run South Sudan Broadcast Corporation, government TV, that's it. So the only account of what's happening in the most important political trial in South Sudan's recent history come from a broadcaster that answered directly to the government. Does anyone seriously believe we are getting the full story? This is propaganda, not journalism. This is a show trial, not justice. And here's what really gets me. When the Association for Media Development and Human Rights Group called this out, nothing changed. The government just ignored them because they can, because there are no consequences, because this is how dictatorship operate. They create the appearance of due process while ensuring no one actually verifies whether justice is being served. So if you are tired of the sanitized diplomatic coverage of what's really happening in African politics, Subscribe to Africa Decode. We are here to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notification because we are not backing down from these stories. Now, let's get into what's actually happening inside that closed courtroom based on the limited information we have, of course. And honestly, it's worse than you think. Prosecutors are submitting evidence that was collected after the case was already referred to court. The defense team pointed this out. It's a clear procedural violation and the court is just moving forward anyway. They are also presenting seized devices, phone, laptop, USB drive, but here's the kicker. They don't have a search warrant. They violated Article 22 of the Constitution. They ignored the Criminal Procedure Act. And the court is considering admitting these evidence anyway. Let me be crystal clear about what this means. The government can now apparently seize your property without a warrant, collect evidence without following legal procedure, and then use that evidence against you in court. If they can do this to First Vice President, what protection do ordinary citizens have? None, absolutely none. This isn't a trial. It's a predetermined outcome wrapped in legal terminology. They are going through the motions of due process with systematically violating every principle that makes due process meaningful. And they are doing it behind closed doors, so no one can document exactly how thoroughly they are shredding their own constitution. But wait, it's getting worse, because while this judicial farce is playing out in Juba, the military is killing people in Western Equatoria State. And their defense? Oh, this is rich. General Lu Raikong says they didn't kill civilians. They killed SPLM-IO fighters who were wearing civilian clothes. Do you understand what he just said? He's claiming the right to kill anyone they suspect of being opposition and then retroactively justify it by saying, well, they must have been fighters in disguise. That's not counterinsurgency. That's a death squad with a press officer. So local witnesses say government forces killed young men who were civilians. The military says no, they were all combatants. And who investigates? The military investigates itself. And what do they find? That they did nothing wrong. Shocking. This is the logical end point of a system with no accountability. When the military can kill with impunity, when they can declare anyone they want to be an enemy combatant after the fact, when there is no independent investigation, no media scrutiny, no consequences, then no one is safe. Every civilian in a conflict zone become a potential target whose death can be explained away with they were probably opposition. This isn't governance. This is state-sanctioned violence. Now, I want you to see how these three things connect, because this is where the pattern becomes undeniable. The Justice Minister tries to criminalize criticism of the trial. The government locks out independent media, so no one can verify what's happening. The military kills suspected opposition members and investigates itself. Every single one of these actions has the same goal: eliminate accountability. You can't have independent courts examining whether the government followed the law. You can have independent media reporting on whether trials are fair. You can have independent investigations determining whether the military committed atrocities, because if you did, the whole system would be exposed for what it is, a dictatorship that uses the language of legality to mask pure politic power. And let's be clear about what this means for South Sudan as a country. This government has proven it cannot run a functional state. It cannot maintain peace. It cannot uphold its own constitution. It cannot even pretend to respect the peace agreement it signed. What it can do is threaten its critics, hide its action, and kill its opponents. That's not governance, that's organized violence with a flag. And you know what makes this even more infuriating? The international community response. This week, the UK and Norway issued a joint statement through Ambassador David Ashley, saying South Sudan peace progress has decisively reversed. They condemned the ceasefire violations, the armed clashes, the detention of opposition figures, which is good. And South Sudanese civilians are sick of it. They are tired of these statements because here's what happens every single time. Something terrible occurs, the international community issue a joint statement, condemnation. Everyone nods seriously, and then nothing. No real sanction, no meaningful pressure, no consequences whatsoever. You want to know what's really galling? The international community helped broker the peace agreement in 2018. They fund significant portions of South Sudan's operations. They have leverage, they have options, but they chose statements over action every single time. Meanwhile, ordinary South Sudanese people are asking a very reasonable question. If you have the power to pressure this government, if you are funding them, if you guarantee the peace agreement they are now violating, why are you just talking? Why does condemnation remain your only tool when the government is systematically dismantling democratic institutions? The answer, I think, is that real consequences would require real commitment. It's easier to issue a statement than to actually do something about a government that's sliding into dictatorship. And so the cycle continues. Atrocities, statement, silence, repeat. Let's zoom out for a moment and talk about what all of this reveals about South Sudan's government and its trajectory. This is a government that cannot tolerate dissent, cannot accept scrutiny, and cannot function within legal constraint. When your justice minister has to threaten people to stop them from discussing justice, you don't have a justice system. When your court have to exclude independent observers because transparency would expose your violations, you don't have rule of law. When your military has to hide its action because investigation would reveal atrocities, which is not new, you don't have a professional security. What you have is authoritarian rule. What you have is a government that maintains power through intimidation, obviously, violence, and the systematic destruction of any institution that could challenge it. The 2018 peace agreement was supposed to transition South Sudan from conflict to democracy. Instead, what we are seeing is a transition from one form of authoritarianism to another. The faces in power might have changed, but the fundamental operating principle remains the same. Might makes right, and accountability is for the weak. Here's the truth no one wants to say out loud. South Sudan's government has failed, not just failed to meet expectation, but failed at its basic functions of governance. It cannot maintain peace within its own borders. It cannot protect its own citizens from its own military. It cannot uphold the constitution it is sworn to defend. It cannot even conduct a trial without violating every principle of due process. And yet, the same government expects to be treated as a legitimate authority. It expects the international community to continue funding it. It expects its own people to accept its rules. Based on what? Fear? Because that's the only thing it's actually competent at producing. What we are watching in real time is the death of South Sudan's democratic aspirations. Every closed courtroom, every silenced journalist, every dead civilian in Western Equatoria, obviously in Upper Nile, massive of them, is a nail in that coffin. And unless something fundamentally changes, unless there are real consequences for these actions, this will only get worse. Dictatorships don't reform themselves. They don't suddenly discover respect for human rights or rule of law. They only respond to pressure, real pressure, the kind the international community seems unwilling to apply. So, where does this leave us? It leaves us watching a country that won its independence through tremendous sacrifices, slowly strangling that independence through authoritarian consolidation. It leaves us watching a peace agreement collapse because the people who signed it never actually intended to share power democratically. And it leaves us watching the international community issue a statement while a government openly dismantles the very institution that could have prevented another civil war. Riek Machar's trial isn't really about Riek Machar. It is about whether South Sudan will have a government constrained by law or a government that uses law as a weapon. And right now, based on everything we've seen, close court, constitutional violations, media blackout, military impunity, and a justice minister who would threaten anyone who asks questions, the answer is pretty clear. This is South Sudan authoritarian moment. The only question left is whether anyone with power to do something about it actually will. This is Africa Decode, and we are not afraid to tell you what's really happening. If this analysis resonates with you, if you are tired of diplomatic doublespeak and want the unfiltered truth, smash that subscribe button, share this video. Let's make sure these stories don't get buried under polite statements and careful language. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think the international community should actually do? Not what they should say, what they should do. Because statements aren't saving lives in South Sudan. Action might. Let's talk about it.